Hello, and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I'm your host, Steve Halley. With me, as per usual, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, how you doing, man?
Dude, doing all right. Winding down spring break, which is tragic, but that means we are closer to summer break, I suppose.
Yes, it's summer break and perhaps $150 oil, right?
Uh,
$7 gas a gallon gasoline.
A quick transition there. I thought maybe we'd get into March Madness a little bit, but yeah, let's
Oh
get
yeah,
right
okay.
into it.
How's your bracket doing?
I did not do a bracket this year, man. I've just been more enjoying the art form.
I see.
Kind of hard to root for teams at this point in the college game since, people don't stay more than 6 months in school, but that's fine.
My understanding is that the NIL payments may actually change that somewhat since collegiate athletes can actually get paid what they're worth now. Fancy
Well,
that.
So I don't think it's been confirmed, but I think I saw some reports that Cooper Flag made as much as $28 million his freshman year at
That's
Duke, which
insane.
is, for some people is a lot of money.
And now AJ DeBonsa is thinking about like legitimately thinking about staying at BYU for another year, and it's kind of like
Sure.
I get it. They lost early in the tournament, and he's not happy about it. He wants
Yeah.
another. He wants another go. Guy loves to win. So
Well, we
anyway,
we
you know
we
who else
usually
loves to win? The president of the United States, Donald J. Trump, loves to win. And my
that
question for
that
you,
might be
Galen,
your best transition to date, man.
yeah, the transition game, much like the collegiate game, is it's in flux and ever evolving with lots of structural differences. The structural difference for me is that it's also spring break, except it's my kid's spring break this week, so I'm completely unfocused. I'm gonna do my best though. We were supposed to go skiing. All the snow melted. We ended up in Palm Springs, which is the diametric opposite of skiing. But hey, we landed the plane, unlike the F-15 that got shot down over Iran. See that?
Yeah.
I'm building, man. I'm building. Anyway, we'll get to all of that. It's week 5 of the Iran war. Is that right?
February 28th. So we're what, 30? Yeah, five
Yeah.
weeks in, more or
5 weeks
less.
in.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're 5 weeks in. Three big questions. The three overriding strategic concerns of this war include: is the regime, the clerical regime, still in charge of Iran? Yes, it is. Is the Strait of Hormuz closed still? Yes, it is. Are our allies still getting attacked by Iran? Yes, they are. The United States remains 0 for 3 by my count. When it comes to how this war is going, it is going 0% well. And things are starting to go wrong. On top of that, we had an F-15 get shot down over Iran, I think last night, California time, something like that. And one pilot has been rescued. So we were talking about ground operations, the possibility of ground operations inside Iran. It's like there's been a ground operation, it's a search and rescue, and we got one of the two pilots. We're not sure what the other one is. If he ends up in Iranian hands, that guy is going to be all over TV and the internet with a quickness. And if there's one thing we know about the Iranian revolutionary regime is they're skilled when it comes to manipulating and exploiting hostages, right, Galen? So hopefully we recover that second pilot quickly.
I would only say that the context here is somewhat different in that
Totally.
I think well, for starters, we're talking about a military target versus a diplomatic target when the Iranians took over the US embassy infamously in 1979.
You're right.
The other thing here is that one I think was a major, although boost to the regime in terms of its ability to consolidate control, just an absolute disaster for them in terms of international strategic implications. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think this is the same as that, since most of the world thinks the United States and Israel is responsible for starting the war. And so
Yeah, it's pretty
keeping
difficult to deny that.
this would be a prisoner of war, I guess.
Yeah, you're totally right. I was being somewhat glib. We should note that the hostage crisis also benefited the Reagan regime.
I think we have noted that before.
We
Yeah.
have, we
Yeah.
have, yeah. So we're at 0 for 3. There have been a number of developments, and for my money, I think the most important development that we should talk about is the increasing frustration that we're seeing from President Trump, his administration is still making all the right noises in terms of the military goals being accomplished. We're continuing to strike targets. I believe we're approaching 15,000 targets struck within 5 weeks, which is just an astronomical number. The nature of those targets is starting to change. We blew up the biggest bridge in Iran, I think a day or two ago. And whether or not this was a legitimate military target, I think is open to interpretation. So, according to the US military, it was because it was being used to transport missiles on trucks, is my understanding. But it's also, a very, very important piece of civilian infrastructure and a new piece of civilian infrastructure that the the Iranians were justifiably proud of. And a number of civilians were killed in the bridge's destruction. And to me, I don't know how you feel about it, but to me, that is a warning sign of where the administration intends to go next or wants the Iranians to think they will go next, because Trump has been very vocal about his willingness to attack civilian infrastructure. He has threatened several times to start attacking Iranian power plants, and which, by the way, would be generally acknowledged as a war crime. And of course, this is under the framework that the United States helped set up at the end of World War II, right? Defining what's a war crime and what isn't. The Russians, by this metric, have been committing war crimes very routinely in Ukraine by attacking their civilian power infrastructure. Would the United States really start doing that to Iran?
By the way, you could argue Iran has been doing that as well.
Absolutely.
Entire Gulf neighbors.
Yeah. We seem to be sliding towards a framework of total war. We seem to be sliding towards escalation on both sides, and that is extremely troubling. When Trump floated this idea earlier in the war, most of Iran's neighbors and the rest of the world were against the idea of destroying the civilian power grid because it might result in a failed Iranian state and really mass civilian casualties. Iran is a very hot part of the world. It needs air conditioning for people to survive, depending on the season. And if we were to blow up all their power plants and return the country, quote unquote, to the Stone Ages, which both Trump and Hegseth have threatened in that exact terminology, which, by the way, is redolent of the Vietnam War, some of the worst parts of the Vietnam War. Yeah.
As a matter of policy, I don't think it is a good idea to invoke the words of Curtis LeMay.
No.
Who, it should be noted, was the vice presidential candidate for George Wallace in 1968.
Yes.
Not Very a guy I tend to model my own behavior after. So using the term bomb back to the Stone Age is bold the right word? Probably
bold. Not. It is that. In addition to some other adjectives we could use, right? But targeting and blowing up this bridge it seems like a move in that direction, and I don't really like seeing it because it opens questions about what's next, right?
Look, I think you had this right earlier than most people. I was sort of like moving in your direction, but to me it seems pretty clear that Iran is winning.
Yes.
We now have reports that they certainly think they're winning.
Mm-hmm.
That was, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal about it, but I think, much more broadly, that seems to be the tenor of their negotiating strategy right now. The one, we've talked about their vulnerabilities in the past. I think violating the principle of freedom of navigation, particularly over a waterway as key as this one, ultimately is something that has the potential to leave Iran even further isolated. But as we've spoken about, Iran tends to be okay being isolated. They have been largely isolated for, a good portion of their existence. And the rest of the world, I don't think holds Iran accountable for the present state of affairs. Now that could shift if, there's enough economic harm, which I'm sure we'll get to. Things are, in both of our opinion, going to start biting here pretty quickly. This is a key principle. Again, I'm going to invoke a different Clausewitzian principle this time, which is war in its natural form tends toward the absolute. Mm-hmm. And that is why you need competent civilian leaders in place to prosecute wars in keeping with your political objectives. The problem in this case, as I said, I think Iran is winning. By the way, I think even some of the super hawks are, at least, I don't think they would phrase it this way, but I take some of their recent comments as potentially acknowledging to some degree that Iran is winning. So John Bolton, who is like the high priest of regime change in Iran and
Yeah.
talking about bombing Iran going back to like the early 2000s,
Mm-hmm.
he's basically been critical of the administration because of how they're doing it, which to me is like a nicely unfalsifiable claim. Hey, if we did it his way, it would have worked out. It's not the principle of regime change itself.
It might have had a better chance. And I think we've made this point. It's like, if you're going to do this, it wasn't a good idea and we don't condone it. But if you were going to do this, you should have done it differently and better. And in particular, by preparing like some forces on the ground.
Which is what Bolton is claiming. And again, I have no way, as does anyone else, of determining whether that is true or false. I think we would both agree it would have been extremely high risk.
Yes.
And I tend to be skeptical that it would have worked, but I take that somewhat as an implicit, like, starting to hedge, right? The IRGC, I think we both believe, is now more firmly in control. I suppose we could debate that. And I think my main takeaway from Trump's address, which I found frankly puzzling why it was given. No, I mean, honestly, like, I'm not sure. There's clearly some pressure building, and probably some of his political aides were telling him, hey, you've got to say something to explain what's going on to the American people. I think probably he has now been told if this drags on much longer, markets are going to start to get deeply unsettled and you're going to have economic pain. And so if he can, say the U.S. has struck this many targets, maybe that helps calm markets. But I heard nothing in there in terms of what the game plan is going forward. He explicitly says he has no strategy on how to reopen the strait. He said it would reopen naturally. It will just reopen naturally.
Why would he believe that?
I don't know. Maybe he doesn't, but that is in fact what he said. And
I think he probably doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah. And most of the things he boasted about, again, were military targets, not political objectives. Whether this is related to the war, the coverage I've seen shows that there were other reasons for why this happened, but Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, fired or at least put pressure on the Army Chief of Staff to step down.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that could be related to other disagreements, but it could be a sign that they are now looking for a scapegoat to blame the outcome of the war on. I'm speculating there. I'm not sure what that's about. But the key point for me is this is generally how you get escalation or movement toward, as you said, total war, which is the plan has not worked out.
Mm-hmm.
The initial shock and awe, again, we've seen it before not work, did not produce a new government. And the United States finds itself in this difficult position. I took Trump's speech as basically a tacit acknowledgement that the U.S. government does not have a plan for how to get out of the pickle it's put itself into. And so I worry, as you do, about Trump escalating and doing things like strategic bombing.
Yep.
Which we could debate whether the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki produced a surrender. Not everyone even believes that's a clear-cut case, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But we really don't have other examples of this being effective, leaving aside moral considerations about targeting civilians or civilian targets. Frequently, what happens with strategic bombing campaigns is that it's counterproductive because it unifies the population.
There's some evidence that that's happening inside Iran, by the way.
Which would make the own goal of removing an 86, 87-year-old man who was going to die pretty soon and potentially be replaced by more moderate elements even more glaring if we end up undermining arguably the U.S.'s key asset in Iran, which is the population's dislike of the current government.
Yes. There is a lot there. So,
yeah, sorry. That was kind of a rant.
No, that's okay. I am feeling similarly nonplussed about like the conduct and the evolution of this war. And it's like there's just so many things that we could talk about. Pretty much everything has gone wrong, and it's almost like where do we even begin? Trump
Well,
did
the military execution
yeah.
has been quite good, but that
It's
is very
it,
different than achieving political
it's
objectives.
also not relevant. And like that's the key point that we've made over and over again. It's like you can blow up as many targets as you want until you're in fact out of targets. And like the Trump administration and Israel are running out of military targets. Is what our understanding is. Like at least the easy to get ones. It's like they've kind of hit that 80-20 point. And now they're eyeing civilian targets because like those are easier to hit and they might exert more coercive leverage. It's like now this is an arm twisting exercise, but neither you nor I believe that the Iranians will just give up if the U.S. and Israel blow up all their power plants. I think that would make them completely implacable, and at that point, they would launch everything they had at everything they could hit within the region in a paroxysm of revenge and make things a lot worse for everybody involved. And by the way, this also still wouldn't reopen the strait. So it's kind of like, well, what would the point of that be? There wouldn't be a point other than to make things worse. But it's like, what's the point of what's happening now? Because we're not getting what we want. Trump has said that the regime has changed.
It has
And
not.
yeah, well, so this is interesting though. It may have, but not in the way that we would prefer.
Yeah, but fair enough.
Yeah. So Mojtaba Khamenei is the titular head of the government, the supreme leader, but we're not really hearing much from him or seeing him.
I mean, he might be dead.
Yeah, he may very well be dead, or he may be in hiding. But the point is, it looks like a military junta is actually in charge of Iran, and it's an ideological military junta. And we're now getting figures like Amir Vahidi, in charge of the IRGC, who is a hardliner. And not just him, there's also Mohammad Bagher, who's in charge of the Supreme National Security Council, and Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf in charge of, he's the Speaker of Iran's parliament. But to a certain extent, the three of these guys are forming a triumvirate. It's a little hard to tell what the formal structure is at this point, and it may be hard for the Iranians to tell too, because they're kind of isolated and scattered and in hiding. But these three guys have emerged as prominent leaders within a fractured landscape of leadership within Iran. And like two of the three certainly aren't interested in compromising. They're interested in prosecuting the war to its conclusion, which, as far as they're concerned, will result in the defeat of Israel and the United States, the strategic defeat, not the tactical defeat or the military defeat, the strategic defeat, when the Trump administration is destroyed by high energy prices and Israel loses the sponsorship of the United States after being blamed for leading the U.S. into this war, whether or not that's actually fair. And we can talk about whether or not it is fair. I think, as you like to say, we'll find out 50 years from now when the archives are opened, right?
I mean, I think there is it was a factor.
It was a factor, most likely.
But to say that is the sole story, I think would be grossly inaccurate. But it was a factor, albeit I think an important factor.
Yeah. So Bahidi and Zolgadar are on board to prosecute this war to its conclusion, however long that takes. I think Ghalibaf is a little bit more of a pragmatic figure, but he's certainly espoused a lot of bellicosity.
Yeah, I think he, I think if anything, he's a little, from a U.S. standpoint, less amenable to compromise than someone like Larijani, who, as we've said before, was a pragmatist, but a fairly hardline pragmatist. So if Ghalibaf is the best you're dealing with now, you're dealing with a government that's going to negotiate easily. And I find it noteworthy that Iran has not relaxed any of its
5 principles, right?
Yes. And, the timeline I have seen on this is, first of all, we should say things are already really biting in the rest of the world.
especially
Um,
Asia.
correct. It's not as bad in the United States just yet, although I think, gas prices at the pump are now over $4 and oil has gone up something like 60% since the war started. And we've talked
Hmm.
before about all of the other commodities that are affected by this. But what the number I've seen given is something like 6 to 8 weeks. Things are going to start to really bite within the United States as well.
Hmm. We're
Um,
week 5.
and well, no, I mean from now.
Oh, from
Uh,
now. Okay.
so Iran has to know that
Hmm.
and will know that its bargaining leverage will increase.
Right.
And so, one of the mistakes that has been repeated here, Iran had a front row seat to the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq, of course, borders Iran on its west, Afghanistan on its east. It saw that the US bogged down in both of those conflicts, despite, multi-decade commitments. It also, I think, is probably thinking the same way the Taliban was toward the end of the US commitment there, which was there was this famous saying attributed to Taliban commanders, which was the Americans have the watches, but the Taliban has the time.
I love it.
And I think Iran is probably saying time is on our side and is sort of daring the United States to escalate from here, right? It
Hmm.
said things like, we are waiting. Ghalibaf has said, if U.S. troops enter Iran, they'll be eaten up with fire,
We
fire
will
will
set them on fire.
set them
Yeah.
on fire. Yeah. By the way, I highly recommend it. I thought it was one of the best things I've listened to since the war started. The BBC interviewed a former Obama administration official, Elon Goldenberg,
Mm.
who performed a huge number of war games on what this would look like. And my takeaway from that is like they basically nailed it
Right.
to this point. The only thing they got wrong, which is actually worse, is that Iran would be able to keep getting its own oil out of the strait. So that is one major thing that is actually worse from an Israeli standpoint.
So the
And
U.S. could interdict Iranian tankers, but if they did that, then energy prices would get worse.
same thing,
First,
it
yeah,
could bomb Harg Island, but energy prices would get worse. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh,
So it's like that would actually be easier than attempting to take Karg Island. Is
yeah.
just interdicting those tankers and taking it off the market. But the U.S. has actually done the opposite. It's given Iran sanctions relief
And
for
Russia
its
saying
tankers.
relief. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like you want to know who has the strategic upper hand. It's like if you are giving your enemies sanctions relief on the oil that they are exporting while fighting an active war against one of them, that kind of tells you all you need to know, I would say. It's like, in what other circumstance would you be doing that? It's like it's a strategic disaster, right? It's
Well, I only brought this guy up because he says, look, they have gamed out what happens if the US escalates from here. And what
yeah,
happens is Iran does not back down. Iran escalates in turn.
right.
And if it goes after, as we've said before, more oil and gas infrastructure in the Gulf or fixes more missiles on Israel, which I should say, there have been reports Israel is now rationing its interceptors,
Yep.
which I think is highly significant.
Yep.
That would have even greater consequences for the global economy. And I think that is why Trump is now playing around with the idea of, I'll just wash my hands of the Strait of Hormuz and maybe end the war without that being fixed. But that would be a major defeat. And however he wants to spin it, I personally think one of the major reasons he has had this fixation on Iran is that he has been determined to show that he could get a better deal than Obama did, because he campaigned so aggressively against the JCPOA. If this war ends with Iran in control of the Strait of Hormuz and ascendant in the Middle East, that's going to look like a very bad outcome for him politically.
Total 180-degree strategic defeat. And it will destroy what's left of his presidency, I have to think. Although, we've said that many times about him, so it's
So
probably
that's
premature.
why I think this is like actually the critical test is if you see real economic pain reach the United States and his political standing doesn't drop, then I actually will fully subscribe, as I have leaned toward for some time, toward the idea that, you know, either American politics has fundamentally changed because polarization has calcified to such a degree, or there's something special about Trump that makes him, Teflon to these sorts of forces that normally really hit Americans.
Yeah, inflation is pretty corrosive when it comes to American politics, and to a certain extent, it's like gravity. I think Trump is able to shrug off or dodge a lot of problems that, like demonstrably, a lot of problems that would have sunk other politicians and other presidencies. Inflation is a really tough one because
Yeah.
you can't like jawbone it. People see prices every day, and the prices are going up. Gas prices cannot be avoided in any meaningful sense. You know what else can't be avoided, even more so for more people, is diesel prices, which are actually increasing faster than passenger car gas prices. And diesel prices are significant because most goods move around to the United States in the form of long distance trucking. And trucks run on diesel.
Yeah.
And if diesel gets a lot more expensive, then shipping gets a lot more expensive. And that gets passed on to the consumer very, very quickly.
Yeah. I'm so reluctant to make predictions about American politics at this point. I was,
Yeah.
I forget what news outlet it was, but reporting basically on some of, Trump's supporters. And I think this guy was a farmer and he was saying, the cost of his fertilizer had like gone up substantially and how that was
Yep.
going to affect his business. And he was like, I'm still with Trump, ride or die.
It's
And
like, okay, you might die. Like,
well, I think there is a firm floor, and I'm not going to try to speculate on what percentage of the American people that is, but like
yeah.
to the extent there is a middle left in the United States, I think he's very vulnerable
Yeah.
in that regard. And that's why I would be very surprised. Although I did want to ask you, like, on the Iranian side, if they back down, but there was this letter that the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, wrote to the American people, which was sort of interesting in terms of its tone.
It was interesting. And it was, in particular, like conciliatory. So, to a certain extent, I think he was playing good cop to the rest of the regime as bad cop. And it's unclear to me whether or not this was coordinated. It could be, or it could be that this is a right hand, left hand situation, which would make sense given what's happening inside of Iran and like
Yeah.
sort of the disjointed, multifarious nature of the regime now. It's like it's hard to coordinate when you know that the Israelis and Americans are monitoring your communications and trying to assassinate you.
Well, and to that point, like people said prior to the war starting for decades, how difficult it was to get clear insight into the inner workings of the Iranian government. So if it
Yeah.
was difficult then, it's extremely difficult now.
Yeah, it's only gotten harder. Anyway, Pezeshkian has a reputation as a moderate and as a dove, like relatively speaking, within the Iranian regime. He is the president, which at this point, I don't know if you could call it like a ceremonial office, but given the changing nature of the regime, like at one point, the Iranian presidency kind of meant something. But in the middle of a war, it's like the IRGC is very much in control. And we've seen that already. And so I don't know like how much juice diplomatically this letter actually has, but he was saying, look, Iran is a very proud civilization that's been around continuously for thousands of years. We are not at war with any civilian population. We're at war with your governments who attacked us first. And, this was a letter to the American people. He asked the American people to consider whether this policy really served American interests first. He used that term, America first. This is actually like helping America first, and I think it's pretty clear that at least right now it's not. And then he went on to say, like, there's another path available, the path of diplomacy instead of the path of escalation. And like, it is still possible for us to find an on ramp, off ramp, and like, have a civilized relationship, basically. And I don't know if any of this is true, whether he believes it, whether he has the power to affect change at this point. I think there are like major questions about that. But as far as PR goes, like I think it was like pretty effective because this got picked up in the media and run with. And
Yeah.
yeah, the Iranian regime is proving adept, I would say, at some of this PR activity, maybe more adept than the American or Israeli governments.
So, okay, I'll start with like why maybe you could put a little stock in it, but in general, I'm very skeptical that you should really
Me too.
put much stock in the letter. So, I think it was in Foreign Affairs. I read an article that quoted Iran Watch, I think, that somehow reported internal deliberations where, Pezeshkian was talking to other Iranian officials of like what happens after the war with our own population. And a IRGC commander basically was like, we can continue to take a very hard line. And Pezeshkian was like, really, like, this is your idea? We're just going to like continue forever to govern our own population with an iron fist and like brutally repress everyone for a long time, and how that's going to have major economic repercussions, which I thought was interesting. But the reason I'm skeptical is this, which aside from the fact that Pezeshkian, remember early in March when he apologized to the Gulf states, and
Mm-hmm.
that apology was basically disavowed by the rest of the Iranian high ups. The Iranian president just hasn't been that powerful of a position historically.
That's right.
The first succession to Iran's first supreme leader, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in 1989, kind of Khomeini's right-hand man, a guy named Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, was sort of the kingmaker and made
Mm-hmm.
Khamenei the next supreme leader, kind of thinking that the presidency would be the center of power. And he got outmaneuvered because Khamenei allied himself with the IRGC, which became the real power base within Iran. You've had a lot of reform-minded Iranian presidents. I mean, the exceptions would be Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, but he kind of didn't actually win the elections when he became president. Those were rigged. And Ebrahim Raisi, who died in a helicopter crash, right, I think in 2024. Other than that, you had Mohammad Khatami, who to this day you could argue is like the most reform-minded
Mm-hmm.
ex-Iranian official. You had Rouhani, who negotiated the JCPOA, and you have Pezeshkian. These are all, compared to the rest of the Iranian government, quite moderate people or reform-minded people, and they just don't have that much power. Whether it's as you're saying, there's a left and right hand thing going on, or this is coordinated, I don't know, but I would not pay much attention to Pezeshkian's statements as if you're looking to understand the thrust of Iranian policy right now.
Yeah, it doesn't seem very relevant. And this is a guy like if the Israelis are like even if he is a moderate and what he says doesn't mean anything, it's like the Israelis and the Americans are still going to try to assassinate him. It's just like as a matter of policy, and it's like he doesn't even really matter. Probably, that's just where this war seems to be headed. It's like we're gonna kill this like moderate figurehead of the government too. It's like ideally we would try to like elevate him, like that was the goal of this war. But instead, it's like we're just making more and more powerful and more implacable enemies pretty continuously. It's like the more people we kill, the worse the new people are.
Well,
And
especially if you ultimately end up alienating the Iranian population more broadly, right?
yes, and bombing the power plants and bridges and things like desalinization plants, things like that, will certainly alienate the Iranian populace. And you're not going to have a reform movement anymore. You're going to have a nationalist movement.
Well, so let me ask you then, like, if I look at recent examples where U.S. wars have not gone as planned, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's been some time since I studied the road to major U.S. escalation in Vietnam in July 1965, but I think I have a pretty good handle on it. you know, similar, at least with some levels of government. I think that actually there were people who understood that that was not going to go well. Not a quick war, led to major escalation. And
Yep.
then, you had to find a way out. Shock and awe, right? Was supposed to take care of the problem, and the US would be greeted as liberators. That led to a quagmire and a massive expansion of Iranian influence. Afghanistan, right? The light footprint. We're going to work with the Northern Alliance to unseat the Taliban and then set up a new government there, which can run the country. Also started off well, ultimately led to a 20-year quagmire and a
Right.
fairly disastrous retreat by 2021. But the point is, like, the US has tried to escalate matters first.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that is where we're headed?
It is a pattern, isn't it?
Would that include ground troops?
Yeah. I mean, ground troops would at least offer the possibility of satisfying some of these objectives that cannot be satisfied from the air in any meaningful way. They could be used to take over some of these small islands in the Hormuz Strait and maybe make it more likely that shipping could resume through Hormuz. They could be used to take Harg Island and control Iranian oil exports that way. They could be used to secure the weapons grade uranium or nearly weapons grade uranium somewhere inside Iran, probably underground, buried from the strikes. Was it last June? Yeah, they could be used in a number of different ways. And I guess at this point, it wouldn't surprise me that much rather than just like something completely vindictive, like blowing up power plants. It's like that wouldn't satisfy any objectives. It would just make things worse. The question is whether Trump sees that or whether he's just so pissed off and disillusioned and upset that he just doesn't care anymore.
Well, I mean, look, this is a bad thing I'm about to say, but
Yeah.
in that sense, I can understand why he's musing about calling it off and saying,
Mhm.
whatever, the strait is not our problem. Now, like, I will say, like, I am not trying to say that this was intelligently prosecuted or that they had any sort of plan for dealing with this scenario, because
It's
clearly,
obviously that it wasn't, and they did.
correct.
Yeah.
The only thing I will say is, like, it is true the United States gets relatively little of its fossil fuel from the Middle East. Now, as we've talked about at length, that doesn't mean US prices won't be affected because these things are traded on a global market. But the US has played the main role in keeping the strait open. If you believe that Iran would have done this if you removed American power from the region.
Yeah.
So in a certain sense, you can sort of see the logic of him saying to the Europeans, like, you're the
Get your
ones
own
that
oil.
yeah. Now, like, if that was the argument and the concern, there were better ways to do it than starting an open-ended war. But like, that is true that the US shoulders that burden for the most part.
Yes. But
but-
it's like were they there mostly to do that, or have we been there for decades, like to satisfy a range of strategic objectives, including counterterrorism, including like preventing allies from going nuclear, and so on.
Yeah, I just think that the problem of Iran has been behind a lot of that. And like,
Yep.
absent the deployment, right? This was, I think we talked about this in a previous episode. This was the Clinton administration's dual containment strategy
Right.
of containing Iraq and Iran simultaneously with the direct application of American military power to the Persian Gulf. I have been very critical of that policy, but I acknowledge that it wasn't an easy problem to solve, right? You don't want to rely on Saddam Hussein as your guardian of the Gulf for obvious reasons. And if you can't rely on Iran and the rest of the Gulf isn't powerful enough to resist Iranian power, this is how you end up in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a different story. I guess, like, I can see why he's musing about that as an option. I don't think he ultimately can do that because I don't think the United States...
cut and run?
Yeah, I don't think the U.S. economy can just afford to have the Strait of Hormuz closed indefinitely. I don't think, in terms of like U.S. credibility and power position, that the U.S. can just be okay with Iran charging tolls.
Right. By the way, I read somewhere that if they get that system up and running in a real way, they could make $100 billion a year.
So I didn't see that figure, but I
Yeah.
saw that, yes, they could extract huge amounts of money that would, well more than wipe out whatever damage was done by things like the maximum pressure sanctions campaign that the
Hmm.
administration pursued during its first term. But that is to say, I think he is deeply reluctant to deploy ground troops because he knows that could turn into a quagmire and a forever war, and nothing could be worse. I've said this for years in class. Like, I think just about the most politically toxic thing a U.S. president could do would be to get another major ground war in the Middle East.
Right.
But what does that leave? That leaves strategic bombing.
Yeah.
And I sort of think that's how it's going to go. And I think that in turn, that's going to lead to massive Iranian retaliation, and we could get even more escalation. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
a bleak picture, but I sort of think that's where things are going.
Yeah. And the Secretary General of the UN, I think it's Gutierrez, is that right? Warned recently the Middle East is on the verge of a wider war. And unless this stops, maybe this is kind of what he was talking about. Like we start strategic bombing their infrastructure because we don't want to use ground troops. They conduct their own strategic bombing against Israel and the Gulf states. Perhaps they get the Houthis to close down the Red Sea as well via that
We
choke
should,
point.
we should talk about that because they
Yeah,
did make a show. They're now in the game a bit.
they launched a couple missiles at Israel. It seemed kind of pro forma to me.
Yeah.
It's like they're not doing it yet, but if we start blowing up power plants and bridges in Iran, that might be a bridge too far, so to speak, for them. And then if they choke off the Red Sea the same way the Strait of Hormuz is choked off, then and Iran starts hitting some of this other like power generating infrastructure, energy infrastructure in the Gulf, then we're looking at 150 to $200 a barrel oil and above. And that's just a completely different world
Well,
in
you
every
think
way,
about
shape, and form.
you'd probably be taking offline the Saudi oil that goes through the pipeline.
Yep.
Um,
That's a lifeline, right? And it's not much of a lifeline, but it's helped.
it does depress prices to some degree. And then,
Yeah.
tankers have to go around, what is it, the Cape of Good Hope,
Yes.
to, get to places like Europe, which is going to substantially increase prices. So yeah, if the Houthis choke off the Red Sea route, the other thing, as I think we've said before, to deal with the Houthis, like used up a lot of interceptors last year.
Mhm.
And as we have discussed at length, those are in scarce supply. I did read, by the way, that South Korea has really distinguished itself, just as an aside, that it produces interceptors that are pretty good at a fraction of the price that the United States produces them at. So maybe they'll be able to ramp up production, and that'll help ease the interceptor supply.
That's interesting. And it seems like a common theme. It's like the US has the highest ceiling when it comes to military equipment in terms of the absolute top of the line, most expensive, best stuff. But there's kind of not enough of it. And we can't replace it fast enough to deal with these cheaper systems that are much faster to replace and build more of and just much cheaper. And it's like we're still kind of fighting with a 1990s 2000s mindset, and like we're making moves to try to like build our own Shaheds. They're called Lucas drones, right? Which I think is kind of funny. And our own like cheaper interceptors and directed energy weapons and things like this, but like we're behind the curve. And it's possible that we're about to lose a war as a result of that, to just like a 10 to 100x more cheaper stuff, right?
Well, if you think that this is becoming an asymmetric war,
It
and I
is. Yeah.
think you could make a strong case that it is, Iran's whole game is asymmetric war.
Yes.
That is not the kind of war the United States historically has wanted to fight. The U.S. wants to fight,
Pitched battles.
high volume conventional battles where it can rely on its technology. That's not the game that we're currently seeing right now.
No, they're fighting an economic war, a blockade war, and it's working. I think we should talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel.
So I was going to say we need to get to the Israel piece. I wanted to make one
Yeah.
other point, which is related to what you just said, which was I think the administration just submitted a budget that includes $1.5 trillion on defense.
Wow.
Now, U.S. defense budget is obviously historically astronomically high, like in the $800 billion range. This is like doubling that
Yeah.
almost. And, coming at the expense of potentially popular domestic programs.
All other discretionary spending,
Yes,
basically, right?
that is not an America First policy, I would argue, for his base. Now, we have not seen his base fracture on this just yet, by the way. Like, among Republicans, I think the number I saw is like 75 to 80% still support. By the way, like, somewhat meaningfully down from 100,
Yes.
which is like roughly where Democrats are. I think they're at like 95% or something like that,
Right.
but still quite high. So I don't know if that will change based on this budget request, but that number is enormous.
It is enormous. And it's like, are we drawing exactly the wrong lessons from this conflict? It's like, ideally, the budget should go down and we should be using it more efficiently. But it's like, no, we're going to do exactly the opposite of that, seemingly. Maybe a lot of that's R&D to try to like race to catch up with these cheaper systems and develop like new defensive technologies and things like that. I don't know, but like,
I think
that's
part of it. I think a lot of it's from Golden Dome.
Golden Dome. Yeah. So Golden Dome, it's like that's national missile defense. And if the Iranians, if we lose this war, which we're on track to do, and the Iranians get ICBM technology, it's like, well, do you want to bank on that to try to stop them from hitting New York or Chicago or Los Angeles next time? I don't know. It seems like there would be better and more efficient ways to do this.
All right, but before we talk about Israel, then, like,
yeah.
if you were advising them, what would you tell them to do? Because I was thinking about this
the U.S. government.
Yeah, and I was like, now that you're in, I don't have a great answer to that question, which is why I wouldn't have done it in the first place. But here we are.
What's interesting about the United States is, yeah, we do have this like escalation trap mentality where whoever's in charge at the time cannot be seen to lose. And so they pretty much always go forward. And then the next person comes in and tries to find a way to extricate. Usually with a little bit more thrashing around. Sometimes it takes more escalation and more mistakes and more administrations before we finally find a way to like get out.
Nixon and Kissinger on Vietnam, right? Needed
exactly.
A decent interval before they could withdraw.
A decent interval and also their own escalation, by the way, in Cambodia and Laos, which is like, what? Like,
and I believe the bloodiest year from an American perspective of the Vietnam War was 1969, Nixon's first year in office.
Yeah, I think that's right. So yeah, it's never a straight line, and it's not usually the same administration that like made the mistake. So if we follow the same pattern, Trump is about to make more mistakes and bigger ones. I would urge the administration to resist this historical pattern and enter into real negotiations with the understanding that we don't have the leverage that we think we have. The Iranians are winning, and we're going to end up in a worse place than we were before the conflict started. Like, I think that's just baseline, and we need to be able to recognize it. I don't think we will, but that would be my strong advice at this point in time. And I think under those circumstances, maybe like there would be a deal somewhere in there. I don't think it would involve reparations, but maybe we involve like shared sovereignty over the strait and like some tolls or something. I don't know. Like, I don't know what it would take. But like, I think it starts there. And the further we go in the opposite direction, the more impossible that becomes. And over time, the worse things get domestically. Right? I think that like the barbs are in. if you think about like an arrowhead or a fishhook or something like that.
Yeah.
And they're kind of only going in one direction, right? And Trump has proven willing to, for lack of a better term, like cut and run or drop something that isn't going well that he's no longer interested in. The question is like, can he actually just walk away from this with no consequences? And I think we agree the answer is no. It's like the Strait of Hormuz will not magically reopen once we stop bombing. It's like I just said that the Iranians could make hundreds of billions of dollars from charging tolls in Hormuz. At a minimum, they're going to need a lot of money to rebuild all the stuff that we just destroyed. And that money's not going to come from anyplace else. It's not going to come from Russia or China, really. We're not going to probably remove sanctions unless we end up cutting a deal, right? So, I think a certain amount of that is priced in no matter what we do at this point. I think regime change is like completely off the table. So it's sometimes it's about finding the least worst.
Yeah.
And I think we're very much in the world of the least worst at this point. But I don't know that Trump is a guy who can acknowledge a need to find the least worst solution.
Yeah. I would only add to that, and these are somewhat, well, at least medium term, but long term things you could do. I always try to keep things in grand strategic perspective. And although I suppose purely in career terms, it is good for me to have the Middle East be the center of everyone's attention, I don't think that is the key theater for the United States. I think the key theater remains the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah.
And so getting bogged down here would not be a good thing in grand strategic terms.
It's already happened. And we've already spent all of our missiles and all of our interceptors and all the stuff we'll need to, fight over Taiwan.
So there's that. And maybe that's a piece of the $1.5 trillion defense budget request.
Right.
But, doing things to lessen your dependence on fossil fuels. So if only someone had warned about that, right? That is one way to insulate yourself. China is more insulated than it was, as is, was it you who said Pakistan now has been able to absorb this because they've imported so much stuff from China that's in the renewable space?
Yep.
And, the other thing, which will nicely segue into the Israeli piece of this, is this view started becoming less popular. I will grant that perhaps you can make a case it wasn't as big of a deal as it was during the Cold War, although I think maybe everything that has happened in the last nearly 3 years has potentially thrown that into question. But, I have always thought that the Arab-Israeli conflict is linked to what happens in the rest of the region.
Mm.
And if you view what has happened not as just a war starting on February 28th, 2026, but as a process that has kicked off far before that, and kind of the immediate precipitating event being the horrific Hamas attack of October 7th, 2023, then I think the Palestinian issue looms very large. And the United States has, as far as I can tell, dedicated very, very little political capital toward addressing that problem, really since the end of the Clinton administration.
Yeah, I think they've made it worse, especially now.
Well, I guess with that in mind, we should talk about the Israeli piece of this.
I think Israel is in deep trouble. Really deep trouble.
I tend to agree.
I think Netanyahu rolled the dice, and I think he understood that he was rolling the dice because he felt like he needed to for himself and also for the country of Israel. And I think the results have not been favorable. And you've said Israel's running out of interceptors. That means that civilian costs are going to mount. They're already rising. Because, yes, they can play offense, but they will run out of the ability to play defense. And they haven't played enough offense to blow up Iran's ability to play offense. So Israelis are in bomb shelters. More civilians are getting wounded and killed. I don't even know what's going on in the north of Israel and Lebanon at this point, but it's disrupted.
Hezbollah has been able to hit northern Israel,
Yep.
and that
So
has
it's
been
disrupted.
a factor. And,
Yep.
in some ways, in terms of purely Israel's military resources, taking the fight deep into southern Lebanon is maybe a bigger strain.
Mm,
And, so far, although we've seen things like settler attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, things have been relatively quiescent there and in Gaza. There's no guarantee that that will continue.
yeah. You and I and our friend Professor Andrew Lieber have all made the point that if this war ends up not going well, and it's not going well, and that's going to get more and more obvious to everybody all over the entire world, including in the United States, a very convenient scapegoat will be Israel for the Trump administration. And the words Israel and scapegoat just don't go together in a way that any of us are comfortable with for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But if Israel loses its special relationship with the United States as a result of losing a war that it fought with the United States, that would be maybe the biggest strategic disaster in the history of the state of Israel.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I still don't, I'm still not persuaded that that's going to happen, just because that's been predicted so many times. But you are seeing things like, she is obviously not representative of where the average American is, but AOC, I think, recently stated she would not favor supply, not just, various proposals you've seen in the past, like reducing whatever Israel spends on settlements in the West Bank, cutting that from like the U.S. economic and military aid packages that Israel receives from the United States, but all military aid whatsoever, including defensive aid. Whether that's a bellwether, I couldn't tell you, but she's obviously a major figure in one of the two parties in the United States.
She could be president next, or Newsom, who's also, I mean, he's an opportunist, but he's made some noises in and around this stuff. Who knows what he'd actually do when and if he became president.
I think it's hard to say, and just to flesh it out a bit, I think it would be wrong to say this war happened because of Benjamin Netanyahu. Like, Trump is his own actor, and Trump has shown that he is willing to take a harder line with Israel in some narrow case, not on the big stuff, right? Not on something like the two-state solution. But I think it was a factor. And I think more importantly, the perception among many Americans is that it was arguably the key factor, and perception is what matters in this case. So that could be very dangerous if this ends up going as badly as it could. That's a little hard to predict. But in the meantime, even leaving all that aside, you and I both read this article that I forget who the co-author was, but Amos Yadlin, who was, I think, the head of the IDF's military intelligence unit. I can't remember when, but wrote in Foreign Affairs. And I found it a very weird article to read. I've seen Israeli officials kind of try to make the case that strategically Israel is a force multiplier for the United States. I'm, as I've said before on the show, not terribly persuaded of that argument.
Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but like a multiplier to do what?
Well, look, fine. Again, we keep coming back to this.
Yeah, to make terrible mistakes.
In purely military terms, the IDF is the gold standard for fighting excellence on planet Earth. Like, no dispute, but like, that's not what matters. What matters is political results.
Yeah.
And for a variety of reasons, which we've covered at length, so I won't rehash, I'm skeptical. But the part of the article that I found very puzzling was like discussing the new Middle East and the transformed, peaceful, economically vibrant. And I'm like, how are we even like looking forward to that at this moment? Like,
we're further away than ever. It's like, it's a wonderful vision, and some aspects of it were, starting to come into view prior to this conflict in terms of like the transformation of like the Gulf Arab states' economies, and Israel being rich and powerful itself and at peace, sort of, depending on how you define that. But yeah, it's like this idea that the precondition was like a democratic Iran to really doing this. It's like, well, if you really believe that you're going to fight a major regional war to get that done. And, it just reminds me of like the rhetoric around World War One, right? Like a war to end all wars, and
Wishful thinking. Yeah.
yeah, and to make the world safe for democracy and so on. It's like none of that stuff was true or made any sense, basically. And I feel the
Well,
same way about this.
yeah. And the other thing, the reason I think people should read it because I think it does tell you something about Israeli official thinking, although Yadlin, I don't believe, is still a government official at this point. And again, I can't remember who co-authored it off the top of my head, but I did see a report by the New York Times that Israelis are now concerned, like they might be just forever at war. And my immediate reaction to that was that kind of was already the case.
Yeah.
And the doctrine espoused by people like Prime Minister Netanyahu was like, that was kind of the doctrine if you weren't able to get a game changer such as a new regime in Iran, which again, neither of us thinks is going to happen. And it's this cycle where like they are now back in Lebanon, right? I think I mentioned this before, but Israel launched a major operation in Lebanon, I think in 1977 or 78, Operation Litani. They did a full-scale invasion in 1982 that had quite ambitious war aims, including basically regime change in Lebanon and a peace treaty with the Maronite Christians. Israel did not get out of that conflict until 2000. And Ehud Barak, who was prime minister at the time, he prioritized that above the peace process with the Palestinians because Israelis were so over having the security belt in southern Lebanon. They then had to fight a month-long war with Hezbollah in 2006. Yes, they had that amazing operation a few years ago, the Bieber operation. Here we are again, and they are now, I'm not sure whether they're looking to occupy a territory indefinitely in southern Lebanon, but they are trying to stamp out Hezbollah, and I just think that's a tall order. And so I don't see a way out of this. And I'm sure some people will object, and I am not someone who puts this squarely on the Israelis. I think the Palestinians have made mistakes of their own. I certainly think the United States has made a huge number of mistakes over the history of its involvement in Arab-Israeli negotiations. And there are groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad that are spoilers. But I really think, and I would be in good company with the slain Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in thinking this, that the best strategic move, leaving aside anything else, purely in power political terms, the best thing Israel could do is have peace with the Palestinians. And I know that's not really top of mind right now because of the war with Iran. But I'm just skeptical that any Israeli government is going to want to turn its attention to that. And even
I
in
don't
that
think it
article
can right now. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And even in that article, Yadlin doesn't really say, like the goal is peace. It's like to begin starting the process of maybe eventually, who knows when, getting to peace. And
well, on their terms, once everything has been prepared the right way through military victory, right?
well, then, when is that going to happen, right?
Well, you actually have to win first, and maybe they bit off more than they can chew. And my question is, if Israel loses this war and fails to satisfy its strategic objectives, which I think it's going to do, it's not going to satisfy. We're not going to get a democratic Iran. We're not going to get an Iran that doesn't attack Israel anymore. I just don't believe that. It's probably going to be the opposite. Will this result in consequences for the Netanyahu government? And if it results in political consequences and we finally see the back of Benjamin Netanyahu politically, is it possible that there could be a resurgence of the Israeli left at some point? Because I think that's a precondition to anything that you're talking about.
Except the other option, which is ruthless American. I think those are the only two ways. And I just have a hard time believing the former because the Israeli left has just been so decimated,
Yes, but these things move in cycles, right? And it's like the Israeli left has been decimated for a lot of different reasons.
of a century, really.
It's been a while before it was really an effective force. And it's like the centrists are now center right. You know, it's
Correct.
like they're the new
Yeah.
Israeli left. But it was the case that Israel had like a real, left wing, and it had power at one point in time. And there was interest in like an enduring peace with the Palestinians on something approximating, you know, terms that could actually last for some period of time. And like we never got that close. But I just think like restoring that desire within the Israeli voting public, the Jewish voting public, is going to be necessary to get out of this. And it's like I think Israel needs to probably lose a war
Well, I'll
before
make
that happens.
one comment and two questions I get. I'm very skeptical that would happen. So
Yeah.
going back 50 years next May, Labor, the left wing, previously dominant left wing party in Israel, has held office. What Rabin was 92 to 95, Barak was 99, 2000. That's 5 years. And then Kadima, a centrist party, 06 to 08, maybe. So we're talking a less, like around 15% of the time.
Right.
Netanyahu is now by far and away the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. If you include his 3-year term in the 90s, I think he's been prime minister almost 20 years collectively, maybe like 18 or 19 years. And has won, I'd have to go back and count, but like 6 elections, maybe something like that.
Yeah. I mean, he's the colossus of modern Israeli politics. I acknowledge all of that, but like historically, like losing wars wrecks political careers.
But my bigger point is like, who's going to replace it, right?
I don't know. Yeah.
You know, even someone like Benny Gantz, you noted, like centrist, is now pretty far to the right of where someone like Rabin was in the 90s. So
but
I guess
if you lose a war and, like Israel's economy is disrupted and they can't protect the civilian population and it's a big mess. Like, I don't mean like the failure of the Israeli state or anything like that, but like a big strategic disaster. They don't satisfy the objectives and they actually can't protect themselves effectively.
Yeah, I guess I just,
Like,
the 82 war in Lebanon was a loss.
yeah.
And it did lead to Menachem Begin, then Israel's prime minister, getting forced or resigning. And it did temporarily destroy Ariel Sharon's political future. But it's worth noting Sharon became prime minister for 6 years.
Yes.
And it's worth noting that Begin was not followed by a left-leaning guy. He was replaced by Yitzhak Shamir.
Yeah.
Very, very hardline guy, a formerly designated international terrorist for 8 years, something like that. And it's worth noting as well, October 7th happened on Netanyahu's watch.
Yes.
And there were all sorts of predictions that his days were numbered, and here we are. So I don't see a whole lot of space on the Israeli left. And I take your point, these things can shift. But the real question I have for you is like, if these midterm elections in the United States end up being, a wave election for the Democrats, do we see Congress not appropriate funding to Israel? And that's not something that really has ever happened.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Possibly. Whether or not that actually stops money from getting to Israel remains to be seen, given this administration's attitude towards the rule of law. Yeah, but I don't know. I think that's within the realm of possibility. Yeah, absolutely. I think like a lot of like previously unconscionable things and shibboleths and institutions that we've taken for granted are now very much within range of change as a result of this. And change is rarely simple or easy. It's often very painful. And I expect what comes next as a result of this conflict. This conflict is still like a live war and might be escalating.
Yeah.
So there's going to be pain there, but like even afterwards, there's going to be a lot of pain coming out the other side. But like I do see a trajectory for real change in the United States and in Israel as a result of this. So you're more pessimistic than I am, and you're probably right to be pessimistic. You certainly know more about Israeli politics than I do.
Yeah. The other thing I have on my mind is like, there's been various studies done of it. People are interested. I think it's by Michael Koplow, Paper and Security Studies, like 15 years ago now. It basically shows like what American public opinion does, when these crises happen. And like, regardless of the effect on the United States, generally sympathy for Israel goes up when the opposition is seen as, a major enemy. So 1973 war, right? Good example. You could make a good case, in my opinion, that the major stumbling block to peace negotiations during the intervening 6 years, or at least after Anwar Sadat becomes president, is on the Israeli side. That's not to say the Arab states are being completely reasonable or anything like that during that period, but the Israeli government at that time basically was like, we're keeping a lot of this territory. When the Arabs wielded oil as a political weapon, that just made them unpopular in the United States and Israel correspondingly popular. This is a little bit of a different case, but after September 11th, right, sympathy for Israel goes up because now the perception is, we have shared enemies.
Mm-hmm.
If Iran starts inflicting pain on the United States, even if many Americans, particularly on the left, see this as a war of choice that was started by the United States and Israel, it's very hard to compete with Iran when it comes to lack of popularity within the American body politic.
I don't disagree, but it would be like an all-time PR coup for Trump to basically somehow jujitsu this into something other than like a lost war that he started.
Yeah.
And it like, particularly if it's just economic pain, right? And Iran just lets us stew in our own juices. Like the oil embargo and the energy crisis was a political disaster in the US, like an absolute political disaster. If we start getting like, gas station lines and things like that in the US again, watch out. I think all bets are off. I really do. And I just think Americans hate losing wars. And we do a lot of it, honestly. We lose a lot of wars. But we never want to talk about it that way. And
certainly in the post-Cold War period.
Yeah, and we never want to think about it again. Right? And anybody associated with, like sometimes they get rehabilitated, but mostly it's just like they get buried.
Yeah.
And like, it's a real shame, especially for like veterans of those wars who fought valiantly and with distinction and like were tactically brilliant in service of like strategic garbage, right?
As has been the case in this war. They have been tactically excellent, right?
Yes. The soldiers have done their jobs brilliantly, but it's like, should they have been doing what they're doing,
Yeah.
Like they've been following their orders, right? So I don't know what's going to happen. I just we're headed for a giant L.
All right. Well, can I ask you one more thing? Because we've covered the American side, the Iranian side, the Israeli side.
Yeah.
The other player, of course, is the Gulf states, who are unsurprisingly.
I wish Andrew were here. Yeah. Maybe we'll get him back soon.
I'm sure he would.
Yeah.
But he had some important stuff.
Totally.
They are clearly losing patience and have been trying to float these proposals via Bahrain, which I think is temporarily on the UN Security Council, to basically get international support to reopen the strait and justify essentially using force to do so. And that has not been allowed, not only by China and Russia, but I think France as well has not been very supportive of those proposals. Quick aside, I did think it was funny that Macron, the French president, basically told Trump to stop talking.
It's good advice.
Basically was like, you need to take this seriously. Stop saying something that's different every day. In fact, maybe just like don't talk for a bit.
That would be great.
Anyway, like there have been some reports that some of these states, especially like the UAE, are considering entering the fray.
Yeah.
And leaving aside whether they will, which I think is unknowable, and again, it would be better to ask Andrew that question. Do you think that would make a big difference? Not so much in terms of military capabilities. We heard Andrew say like one of the reasons they've stayed out is like what
would it accomplish?
yeah, exactly. Like the political hit of being seen of acting jointly, particularly with Israel,
Yeah.
would outweigh any military benefit and probably divert resources that could be used to things like air defense of their own sensitive targets. But politically, do you think that would be a major factor on the Iranian side, that now you have managed to unify essentially the whole of the Middle East against you?
I think that they would have to pay attention to it, and they would have to so if the Gulf monarchies were narrowly focused on the Strait of Hormuz, which I think is what they would want to do and what they would have to do, because it's their economic lifeline. And this would not be about like striking Iran as like counter punishment or anything like that. They would frame it as like, we need to get this back open. So it's more of like a naval mission, more of a protective mission. And we will attack Iranian assets that are being used to hold the strait hostage. And that's it. And they make that clear. That might make some kind of accommodation around the Strait of Hormuz more likely with Iran. Like I think that would add meaningful pressure, right? Because like these are Iran's neighbors and they control the other half of the strait.
Yeah.
And it's like, you don't want them to be permanent enemies necessarily. Like you're going to have to do business with them. And Andrew was describing this dynamic where it's like, they're like frenemies, right? Yeah. It's, the Iranians and the Gulf monarchies is like, they have these incidents and these problems. And then like a few years later, all is forgiven because like they have to live in the same neighborhood. And it's kind of this cyclical thing, right? So I think they would look at it and they would add their weight on the scale to maybe some kind of multinational force or something that is starting to take shape. Britain and France are apparently starting to cook up a multinational plan, maybe with the Japanese and others, to try to get naval escorts together, especially if Trump takes his ball and goes home, which is a possibility. There's three things he could do. He could do ground troops, he could do war crimes, or he could take his ball and go home, right? And like, I don't know which of the three is most likely at this point, but like they're kind of like writing him off to a certain extent and planning for the day after. And it's like, okay, what kind of business can we do with the IRGC? And what can we do to reopen this strait? Because that's the most important thing for everybody now.
Sure.
I think they would join that.
I think I might even be a little bit more pessimistic than you, in keeping with the theme of this discussion, which is like, I think the Iranians might calculate at this point that their bridges to the other side of the strait have already been burned.
Maybe.
And so maybe they don't have much else to lose. And I always invoke the Iran-Iraq War, which is like the defining learning moment for the guys who run the show.
Yeah.
Where in their mind, they fought the entire world isolated to a draw, even in the face of things like Iraqi use of chemical weapons. So
yeah.
I don't know. It would be a major development if some of those Gulf states joined the war. I'm not actually too sure whether it would change Iran's calculus, at least while the war is going on.
Yeah. Very, very open question. There's a lot of open questions. We're going to leave it there for this week. I feel like we've covered a lot of depressing territory, as per usual. Thanks, Galen, for another great episode. This has been Global Tantrum.